Welcome to Cris I'd Radio. We are back with Dr. Dani, and she's recovering from sickness. So
Hmm.
if you cough at all, we apologize.
Think I'm good now, mostly.
Good. Excellent. Excellent. I know last week you wanted to be on, but it was a priority to feel better and heal. So,
Yeah, I was at the gym and I saw actually James Hollingshead walked into a destination and I went to go like say hey to him after my session and then as soon as I finished, I just like could not stop coughing and I was like, yeah, I'm not gonna go, not gonna this is not a good thing.
right. We were just talking to my wife because I told her, I said, if Dani can't come on again next week, I was like, can you just do a podcast with me? I'll just trade intelligent women. And she was like, "Yeah, I can do them." So luckily you're back on this week, so that's good. And I think it was maybe Saturday, I sent you this ribcage question that someone had sent me on Instagram. So I think let's go ahead and dig into that. I know you were extremely excited to talk about this, and as I told you before, if this takes more than one podcast, we are going to do it. So let me read the question here. It's the guy's name is underscore caffeined, so clearly he likes caffeine like we all do. It
I like
says,
that.
yeah, you're right. It says, Cris, I'd love to see you and Dani talk about rib cage stacking since it's the new trend on Instagram. After applying it myself with proper bracing and breathing, I'm 100% stronger in my push movements and sore for days in my chest like never before. So, um, where do you think, and this is based off your knowledge, because your knowledge of the rib cage is way more vast than mine, where is the most logical place for us to start this conversation?
Um, I think there are a couple different places we could talk about that. So, like, what's interesting is the ribcage stuff is one of those concepts that people might have previously brushed off and been like, oh, that's too nerdy. I'm just gonna go, pound my chest, which is like, okay, great, fine. But there's a reason that every single person that I work with, like, they know as soon as like they're like, oh God, here she goes about the rib cage again. I'm like, yeah, I know. It's kind of important, kind of a big deal. I think what's important so I don't know what came up on Instagram last week, but there were a lot of people that started making posts about, the rib cage and the compression expansion model, all of that. I think Joe Bennett made a post basically being like, "Oh, this seems kind of dumb," which was surprising to me because typically I agree with Joe on a lot of things. Um, but I want to kind of zoom out because as much as this is like a new thing for like maybe people in bodybuilding, this is something that's been going on in any other industry within healthcare, whether it's like, PT or I guess mostly PT. Um, so forget what I said about any other industry. But like within the PT field, this has been going on, like we've been talking about this for decades.
Okay.
It's not anything new. Powerlifting, it got really, really big probably 2015, 2016, because Chris Duffin started talking about, the stack of the rib cage and the pelvis, and everyone thought he was the first guy that came up with like the open scissor versus the closed scissor position. And that actually comes mostly from a school of thought called DNS, which
Okay.
is a type of neurological integration of how we get muscles to kind of work together based on developmental sequencing. I've not taken DNS courses, so I'm going to preface it with that. But the idea of the ribcage pelvis stacking is nothing new. But what we're seeing is what we'll see with so many other phenomenons is something that is old in one industry or one sport or one area might be new in another. And then people are like, oh my God, it's the new thing. And like hyperfixate on it and kind of forget that all the other good stuff still exists. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yes.
So I think just from like a very basic like deconstructing standpoint, there are a couple different ways to talk about the rib cage. I've talked about it with you from the mechanical standpoint of obviously it determines how our shoulder blades sit. Um, it does tell us quite a bit about pressure management as well.
Yeah.
And pressure management is always going to be what needs to precede force production. And people's rib cages are shaped a little bit differently, which is going to determine not only which movements are probably better training movements for them, um, but also, I mean, gosh, I'd even go so far as to say it can change very far down the road effectiveness of certain training styles.
Okay.
Um, and if I had to bet money in like 3 years, everyone's going to be like, oh, well, they're concentrically oriented here, and so they need to train in this specific way.
Right.
which like I nerd out over that stuff, right? But like how important is that? That's the last 5%, maybe, probably more like 2 to 3%, right?
Yes. Yes.
So let me ask you, I guess, like how much of the rib cage stacking stuff have you been seeing? Because it's always on my feed, because that's like what I don't know, it's always on my feed. So
So let me start here because I think this is a better place. The only time before I met you, um, and we really started digging into the rib cage stuff, the only time I ever thought about rib cage was when I would do like a dumbbell pullover. And that's because years ago I read some Arnold magazine somewhere that talked about it would help me expand my rib cage. And then that progressed into like breathing squats, where you purposely try to expand the rib cage, then squat, you know. And to me, I always viewed it as like, okay, cool. Like it'll just make me look cooler on stage if I learn how to like, in my mind, I was thinking about it more of like chest projection and able to exhale to where my rib cage would expand, right? I never really thought about it in terms of like, oh, my rib cage is set up this way, I should do that, right? Like
hmm.
I'd obviously through going to enough bodybuilding shows and studying pictures, like you can see people's rib cages are structurally set up very different. Like I would the next time you're in and my brother films, I'm gonna get him to take his shirt off so you can see his rib cage. It's wild looking. I've only seen a few people with his style of rib cage, and one of them is his son. So to me, like that kind of leads into like, oh, is there a genetic component to that? Is it completely random? Like is like I don't want to take us down that rabbit hole of genetics and how your bone structure is set up, but in terms of thinking about rib cage, I'd never thought about it before you and I talked. And then honestly, on my feed, I don't get very much of it, if any. Um,
Okay.
I feel like it's still very surface level of people talk about it unless you're speaking on it, and then it's expanded.
Well, there are levels to this too, right? Like at base level, I would say if you can just visualize, I wish I could. Have I used my like app with you where I like pull up my screen or like pull up my app and all the muscles and whatnot?
Yes.
At base level, I think what people are saying now is like you have a rib cage from the side and you have a pelvis from the side, and when those are stacked up in general, that's a pretty good position to be in. But there are layers to that too, right? So if we want to think about the rib cage from multiple perspectives, it's going to influence biomechanics. It's going to influence and be influenced by fluid mechanics, and it's going to be a tremendous influence on our nervous system.
Well,
Um, our vagus nerve descends down through the diaphragm, and so if there's a change in shape in the rib cage, there's a change in shape of the diaphragm,
okay.
and that's going to influence the vagal tone substantially. So if we think about just the base structure of the rib cage, whatever you think about, like visualize that. And then we have some layers to it. So we have the upper rib cage up here. I would say like, ribs that 1 through 4 to 5,
Okay.
maybe. Those move a little differently than the lower rib cage.
Right.
So even now, if you're just thinking rib cage expansion, it's kind of like, okay, well, where? um, anyway, so we have that structure. And the other thing is, it can change shape quite a bit through the costal cartilage at the bottom. And that where that cartilage comes together, it's called the infrasternal angle.
Okay.
So there's a whole line of like biomechanics that it would be really, really challenging. Like it would probably take 6 podcasts, and I have to be like, you know, very, very prepared for it. But I think the important thing for people to recognize, and probably we could talk about this for any major concept, is that when you're exposed to something on Instagram, you're getting like an infographic snapshot of one person's opinion at that point in time. That person probably put that out in some state of the Dunning-Kruger effect too. So what happens is we have this generation, Dave and I were talking about this the other day, we have this generation of people who are getting this education off of snapshots
Oh, right.
rather than really understanding the system.
Right.
So, example of this, when I was powerlifting, probably back in like 2013, 2014, I was really working on trying to stack my rib cage and pelvis, but instead of actually stacking them, all I was doing was pulling my front ribs down,
Oh, okay.
which is a way different bracing strategy.
Right.
Really overuses rectus abdominis, actually put a lot of tension on my adductor tendon. And if I had to guess, probably is part of why I ended up tearing my adductor longus tendon. And you know that whole point is really just to add a little bit of nuance. I think that for anyone when they're learning something new, whether it be about the ribcage or something else, always approaching it with the standpoint of like there's very little that's actually new under the sun. Like when was the last time that you learned something that was actually that like, oh, this is the first time in the world in the history that this thing has been used?
Very rarely. Normally it's like, oh shit, I forgot about that.
Right. Or it's like, oh, it's something from another industry or another context that's brought in. It's like you can, see the letter C in the word cat. And all of a sudden, all you think about is the word C in the word cat, not thinking about all the other words it's used in, or the fact that it can have a CH sound. And I think any tool, any trend, anything we see in that regard on social media probably needs to be viewed through that lens. Like there are people who have literally spent the last 10 years being like obsessive about the rib cage. And so for someone to make, this is the thing after one snapshot, just like any industry, just kind of keep in mind that there are a lot of layers to things. And there are lots of different ways the rib cage can change. There are lots of predictable patterns that it falls into with regards to even like your brother Chaz. I would bet his left ribs are like, like in some weird shape and maybe like angled one direction.
Yeah, almost like they're like flared out. Like you can,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
it's very interesting looking.
Yeah, it's actually really common when you know to look for it. And so what we can take from that or what we can glean from that in general is that the shape of the rib cage is going to tell you a little bit about the state of the diaphragm. And that sounds a little bit woo-woo, but from a very practical standpoint, that is if you have this beach ball in your abdominal cavity. And that beach ball is largely controlled by how well you can pressurize and seal out not only the diaphragm, but the glottis up here. And so if the top of that beach ball is kind of shaped funky, then your ability to pressurize that is going to be much decreased. It's a little bit like that Coke can analogy where like people are like, oh, if you dent a Coke can, or if you like open the Coke can, it's easy to dent versus if it's closed, it's not. Very similar. And so we have the concept, and now we really what the rib cage tells us on an individual is how well they will be able to do that, and the state of their system with regards to that. A lot of people in our industry generally are not going to have great pressure management. I talked to a lot of people that are going to end up overusing like these muscles to manage pressure rather than actually getting good like expansion. And anyone that's listening, if you're writing off like, oh, I know how to do this again, like please keep in mind, I've been lifting for a very long time. I've nerded out over this for a very long time. There's a lot more to it. I've worked with a number of patients over the years. There's a lot more to it, and there are a lot of ways that we think we're doing it correctly that is really just our body's like kind of adaptive way of cheating. So yeah, but I think the other interesting thing about the rib cage is, especially for pressing,
Okay.
um, Zach Couples and Jonathan Morin did an interview a couple weeks ago, and I haven't read the literature, but Zach talked about this in a way that I think is really good, where you might, in theory, be able to shorten your pec at both ends,
Mhm.
but that pec is not uniformly shortened throughout the entire muscle.
Okay.
And there's literature that will show that just because there's a change on one or both ends of a muscle doesn't necessarily mean it's had change throughout the entirety of the muscle.
Oh yeah.
So when
Right.
I watch your training, right? Like your chest training in particular is so connected and so dead on that you can see that entire muscle working. For a lot of people, the rib cage being unable to kind of take shape to allow that muscle to lengthen so that it can shorten, is part of why they won't necessarily get the growth that they're looking for. Does that make sense?
It does. I will say this, and this is like when I would hear people say stack the rib cage over the pelvis to be powerful, here's what I would think. No shit. Like,
Yeah.
right? I mean, because I think about like back to my sports days, like that's where you have the most power and can generate the most force. And I think about like when I squat, when I deadlift, when I would bent row, when I would do barbell rows, when I would press, like, doesn't that just make logical sense to everyone? Like, but I
It
realized
makes logical sense, but people can't execute. Like the number of people that think they're executing a stack and are really just cheating their way through it are freaking wild. For a lot of people, I have to take them to pretty like low level drills at first, like lying down to be like, here's how you can find the position without gravity acting on you.
right.
Then you can find that position and standing with gravity acting on you.
Yeah.
Then you get the privilege of adding load onto that. Now, obviously, there's like, degrees of freedom within that, but Yeah, there's a lot of cheating. And I think, to some end, we need to kind of be okay with that. I used to be really, really picky and be like, if you're not stacked, I don't want you to no, I won't say I was ever that picky, but I used to be a lot pickier about it. But I think that like anything, when you really delve into the intricacies and the nuance and you really start to understand a subject, simpler is better,
Yes. Yeah.
always.
And I think that's what you showed me when we were in person is you're like, hey, you see how you did this to get to this point? I'm like, yeah. I
I don't remember that. Do you remember what motion we were doing?
mm, I want to say it was just standing and breathing and like getting me into a front relaxed pose. And you're like, look at what you're
Ah,
I'm pretty sure that's where it was. And you're like, look where your ribs are. Look where this and you're touching. And I'm like, okay, cool. And you're like, you're accessing this range of motion through not where it should be. And I believe that tied into that's why you look so powerful from the front, is
yeah,
that's how naturally you have built your physique. And I never had thought about that before, right? Because I think it all probably happened so gradually that you just kind of adapt, or you're, in my mind, I would view it like almost like as an evolution, but it was losing access to certain things that I didn't realize were turning off. Is that a proper way to look at it?
yeah. That's a great way to look at it. So especially for people who've trained for a long time, and like this is where like I think I specialize better than almost anyone, just because I've kind of been in the trenches. What happens over time is like if your body had a breaker box, and this is probably the analogy that I gave to you, you might have a breaker box that instead of on off switches has like dimmer switches you can dim up and dim down.
Right.
The more you train, the more you access muscles for training, for stability, for different roles, the breaker box with all those dimmer switches gets really, really skewed one direction. And a lot of times the major task at that point for our brain is, okay, don't let us fall down. So keep center of mass like managed and continue to breathe.
Right.
Those are the two things we must do.
Yeah.
Falling down is, optional. Um,
Right.
and I think even just from like a really general, like if you come up here and you bring your arm up and just look at your internal rotation here, test it
Oh,
with me.
okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now start over. Take your whole chest and drop it down. Like crunch your abs and now check your IR. Way more, right?
Yes.
Now bring it up really, really tall, like hyperextend and check your IR.
Terrible. And that hurt
Right.
feels terrible. Yeah. Yeah.
That's like a really, really gross exaggeration. But anyone who's watching, try it too. You can test your internal rotation and you can turn the other direction and then test it. It's going to be different than if you turn towards it and it's clear. So when we start looking at asymmetries and things like that, the rib cage is often where I start as well because the diaphragm is not the same on the left and the right. Like majorly. The right hemidiaphragm is heavier, it's larger, it attaches further down on the spine. It's got a liver below it on the right side to help it stay in an exhaled state. So you're a little bit more rooted on that right side, left ribs flare up because there's a heart a little bit more on the left side to help put it into a state of inhalation. So I know that sounds really woo-woo. Like I kind of think about it as woo-woo when I start talking about it, but then when I really look at bodies, I'm like, no, like there's fluid in here that has to be managed. Like we're literally a bunch of water moving around. And so if there's a portion of that on one side that's pushing down more than the other or less than the other, it's going to absolutely influence how well we're able to kind of pressurize that cocaine.
That is okay. So here's what I take away from what you just said. And it's actually a conversation that Dave and I had today about a top set. And people are gonna have to stick with me here because it's kind of a long-winded to get back to where you and I were talking. At the point of where him and I are on a top set, I have a couple coaching cues that I think about for each exercise, and then my brain turns off, right? So we use the example of the last time him and I were together, we hack squatted 6 plates, and I think we both got like north of 15. And
Ripsy did.
right, yeah. And I was like, and he said, "Can you talk to me about that?" Like he's like, "What's going through your brain?" I'm like, I usually just say a quick prayer that my back doesn't break, and then I take a deep breath and say, "Fuck this shit, let's go," and that's it. My coaching cue typically for me that I'm thinking about is as long as I keep my abs tight, I'm good. I'm not thinking about my quads working. I'm not counting negatives. I'm not even counting reps most of the time. I'm just like bury that bitch in a hole, stay tight, and power it up, and be like pissing out the damn bottom, and don't. And man, well, in my mind, I'm like, don't manage the stretch reflex. But at this point, that's almost automatic. So within like a top set, I actually want to turn my brain off and allow for muscle memory to take over. Like I've been here, I've hack squat 6 plates, God knows how many times. I just need to see how far I can push my body. And then on my warm up sets, on my feeder sets, on my back off, that's when I'm really hyper focused on like, okay, cool. Like I need the quad to do this. I need to push through this portion of my foot. But when I'm on a max load, I'm never thinking that intricate detail because when I'm focused on that little shit, I miss the point of the top set in my mind. Like that's how him and I both look at it. Is that where the problem gets away with people with rib cage is when they get to that point where the load is so heavy they lose all form and function of it?
Thinking of how I want to answer this because this is something I'm working on with Dave right now.
Okay.
So the rib, there is so much I could say about the rib cage. Like
Yeah.
there's, I hope that anyone who listens to this does not take what I have to say as like, oh, that's it. Like there's so much more dialogue to be had.
Right.
Because again, it influences so many different systems. It is literally the center for who we are. But in this context, you could think about the ability to actually expand the rib cage. When you've got 6 plates on the hack pushing down on you on both sides, if you don't have the expansive capability to load up into that, not just like from here, but like 360 degrees, even
Right.
posteriorly,
Right.
that's where you're going to start to find more of that kind of systemic feel. So like guys that get off the hack squat and feel like, okay, yeah, that was really hard. It was just kind of hard on my whole body, not on my legs.
Oh, got it. Right.
Generally, what that is a lack of internal pressure management
Okay.
where they can have internal pressure to kind of match with pushing down them externally.
Oh, shit. Okay.
Does that make sense?
What, because can I tell you what's really cool is we have that flex hack squat that I use, and I have to do what you just did where to rack it, I have to and then rack because I have to push this way to get the handles in or I'm going to miss. So, first of all, I didn't realize that that's what's happening, but I know when you said that, I was like, that's exactly how I have to rack it. So clearly I have that capability. But yes, like what
Well,
go ahead.
not necessarily,
Oh,
because you
okay.
got that all anteriorly. And if we're going to
Uh,
think, we need this, you did
right.
this.
Okay.
That makes sense. You're really good at this. You
Right.
got no.
Right. Pushing through my back. Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
Because that's what we talked about with your front relax, where your rib cage lifts forwards. You look so powerful from the front, but from the back, those muscles are so busy all the time, you can't display them.
Yes. Yeah. All right. That's really fucking cool to think about.
Does that make sense?
Yes, it makes perfect sense. And again, shows my ignorance with this topic.
Okay, I spent a lot of time.
Yes, 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 you have. But okay, so back into that because where my brain goes next in that realm is what are some base level drills that we can all do to get better at just being aware of our rib cage. Like, what would be the foundation if you had someone who's like just brand new to this shit? And I'm not talking like brand new to training, but like who have never thought about rib cage logically and how it can make them a better lifter, a bodybuilder, a
Yeah,
powerlifter.
yeah. Like where's level zero?
Yes, yeah, 100%. Take home stuff. Yes.
Um, I think I would start with just some supine or sideline breathing, depending on where you are.
And that's what you
Yeah,
had me do on camera with you on FaceTime, right?
I think I had you do a variation of an arm bar,
Okay.
maybe.
I remember laying flat on my back to start.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, again, like the tough thing about giving a blanket statement is everyone's going to cheat through it differently.
Yes.
But learning how to even just like sense expansion is something I work on with people a lot. So like for you here, if you bring your elbows together or close together if you
Yeah.
can you
Better.
turn sideways so the camera can see you? Can you like turn to your side so we can see your upper back? Yeah, now come forward. Good. Now, without letting me hear you, can you take a breath in through your nose and feel a little stretch between your shoulder blades?
Right there.
And without letting your body do this.
Yeah, I can
using
totally.
your back to breathe. So like I wanted to come to that demo because if you take a couple deep breaths there, go ahead and get in that position again. And the general rule here is that nothing should really move.
Right.
And so if your elbows and hands are moving up and down, it tells us, well, you're extending your back, you're breathing with your back a little bit, might be getting some upper trap use, things like that. But the only thing that should move here should be the rib cage actually expanding.
All right.
You're getting a lot of other like back extension, traps on, things like that. And anyone who's watching can kind of see that too. So
Yeah.
you don't have to do that anymore. But I wanted to use that as a demonstration of how even something that like I took you to an end range, so I knew you were going to cheat there. That was intentional. But it's a good example of how something simple like breathing, like you were inhaling with your erectors.
And what's funny is that all I felt that was mid, it felt like it was ripping my mid trap apart. That's what it felt like. So
That's
when,
what it should have been.
and what's funny is that's what I felt, but that's not what you saw. So that shows you how confusing all this could be to try to do it by yourself, right? Because I think you would say that you give me, if you just shot me an email, I'm like, oh, I'm nailing this. Wrong.
I mean, that's why my updates for my clients will take like 2 hours. Because this stuff is, relearning how to move and relearning how to move, because that's really what breath is and what the rib cage is doing is like we need to get all like the rib cage is literally a series of joints that all attach on your thoracic spine. For some reason, we think about it as this like rigid unit. It's like this Lego block that moves. And it's not at all. It's designed to be dynamic. And I think even just having that visual is like, yeah, there's a lot there. So um I think sometimes for most of us, we sit during the day. Really easy place to start. Easiest thing is learn to nasal breathe like
Oh,
consistently
yes.
and do it silently.
That's what
If
I struggle with. When you told me that,
um,
I was like, hold on, what?
I know. If I'm like, if I can hear you, that's not rib cage movement. That is like accessory muscles moving up a rib cage, not like so.
Listen, you can ask my wife when Dave is in town and him and I are here breathing together. She's like, you two are the most fucking annoying humans.
That makes me feel so good because listening to my husband eat, sometimes I'm like, honey, I love you. Man, listening to you eat and chew while you breathe is like you're like a rhinoceros over there.
She says she mirrors the same thing about me. It's like
Yeah.
listening to you eat is beyond annoying. Um, it's like
Heavyweight, super heavy problems, right?
her version of hell is probably like just sitting around me eating. Like if we're on the phone and I'm eating a meal, it's like
Yeah, that's something else she and I have in common.
she's like, "Will you please just hang up and call me back when you're done eating?" Yeah, yeah, I'm good.
But I think one of the easiest things that people can do, like again, most of us sit during the day, sit at a desk, nasal breathe. And even if you can do like quiet nasal breathing on walking to work on things like CO2 tolerance, that will have a freaking enormous effect on your training because you're going to get way better oxygen dissociation tissues as well.
Mm,
Um, so there's, I mean, like, I don't, there's so many cool physiological tricks that we have by looking at breath, especially like CO2 tolerance, vagal tone reset, like autonomics. I mean, there's so much. In addition to just the biomechanics of how things actually like sit, the mechanical advantage or disadvantage relatively the intrafusal fiber sense is super cool.
yeah.
Um, but even sitting during the day, if people can kind of get their place to where their knees are just a little bit above their hip bones, and when
Okay.
they breathe, almost feel like they get taller,
Oh, okay.
that's a great thing to be able to do because as our respiratory diaphragm moves, our pelvic diaphragm has to move.
Oh, okay.
And for a lot of people, especially men that I work with, like if you were seeing a check-in photo where it looks like someone's glutes are like constantly squeezed,
Yes.
just like in a back relax, that's a pelvic floor issue. That's usually a respiratory and pelvic diaphragm issue.
Oh,
And
wow.
that will 100% prohibit growth.
Wow. Did not know that. That's a very cool topic. Hell yeah. So I think we've skimmed the surface of rib cage.
Mhm.
Maybe next week. I know you since you said you see a lot, and clearly this guy has seen stuff about rib cage too. Maybe if we can like brainstorm together like three very common misconceptions that you see people posting online, or maybe just like one or two different areas that you see people are like getting way wrong because of what you talked about earlier with like just seeing a snapshot isn't the whole picture. Um,
Right.
because instantly when I heard that, like, when I get the question of like, Chris, what's your favorite chest exercise? And I say slight incline dumbbell press. And then you'll have four people comment that's like, yeah, but what about incline barbell? I'm like, well, I didn't say I hated that. Or
Right.
you always
Yeah.
post
Yeah.
hammer strength videos. Do you not like those? And I'm like, no, I love them all, but you asked me to pick one. I still like all the others too.
But I think the hard thing about a lot of this stuff too is like, again, like I've been teaching people, especially my clients, about this for a long time now. And unfortunately, it's stuff that like they don't necessarily want to hear. So they like want the answers, but they don't want to hear it. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah. Well, I think it's because it's not sexy, right? It's like if you're like, Chris, lay on your side and breathe in 10 times slow without making any noise. And I'm like,
But if I say that fixed my back double the week of Chicago in 23, and that let my left lat come out, and that let me vacuum a little bit better, there's some context there, right?
correct. Because
Unfortunately, no one is talking about this stuff in the bodybuilding space, and the people that are young, or have not trained long enough, hard enough, or been around that long enough to understand what decades, not just a couple years of hard training does. Like watching Dave, I've got a real life case study as well of what this stuff does. No one else has that I know of.
right.
Um, so
Because I think instinctually, I want you to tell me, hey, like, just change your biomechanics for your barbell row and that'll fix it. Or, oh, like, Chris, do this and you'll get 10 more pounds on your dumbbell row, which will give you a bigger back. Like, we'll buy into that shit all day long. But it's like, if you give me homework that I deem as silly or no one else,
or seems like it's low threshold, and you're like, what's rolling around on the ground going to do for me?
right. Yes. And I think somehow, because listen, I have a hard time selling that to my clients. And it's just like simple things like, hey, when's the last time you've really worked your TVA hard? And they're like, never. I'm like, no wonder you have zero abdominal control. Like, you know, I
Yeah.
need I need you to do 3 vacuums every hour for 10-second holds. And they're like, oh, that sucks dick, man. Like, no, no, thank you. I'm like, okay, cool. Like, have a blown out gut. It's up to you. You choose.
Yeah, exactly. 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 This is really similar. I've got a guy I'm working with right now who he's like, he's awesome, but he's like, I got the shoulder issue, and I'm like convinced it's my back. I'm like, I also agree it's your back. But where do a lot of those muscles actually attach?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, oh,
You should get them to send you an anatomy chart and circle it with a pencil or a pen. Like, can you circle this for me? Like, where do they attach at?
where do they cross? What do they attach to? Yeah, where do they run? T-spine, rib cage. People kind of forget how high up on your rib cage your erector is actually attached to,
Oh, right.
like
Yeah.
massively.
Oh, yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so
I
yeah,
learned that
there's
lesson. I learned that lesson 2 Saturdays ago because I had Chris like I intentionally we normally when we do erector work with a newbie, he'll put like one like towards the middle of the beef of my erector, and then he'll put the other like at the bottom half of my erector and the top of my glute, right? And then we do either reverse hyper, we do hypers, we do a rack pull, we do, something along those lines. And I told him, I was like, man, I'd really like to train glutes on Monday. Can we keep it off my glutes? So move those pads like all the way to like where my low trap insert. And so it's like, then we, yeah, that was a whole nother level of soreness.
yeah. Well, and like if we can come back to the ribcage stuff for a minute too, if people are consuming content, you're going to hear a lot about like the ISA or infrasternal angle and what it is to be a wide versus a narrow, and what those are like two ends of a spectrum, right? And rather than thinking of yourself as like one or the other, recognize that there are n of a billion
Right. Yeah.
spots in between.
Yes.
Um, and like I was thinking about this because when you were talking about erectors, for me, when I got my erectors jacked up, like if I deadlift a lot, which I would never do, um, that is one of the biggest things that will prohibit my or like restrict my hip mobility and shoulder mobility going forward. But for you, getting erectors on just works to kind of recapture whatever sacral nutation you maybe lost from sitting. So there's a lot of other stuff that comes into like how do we make good training decisions around this? To me, when I look at the rib cage, like yes, of course, I want to see it moving, and like yeah, there are a million things I can look at. But as someone who's biased towards loving training, it just helps me make better training decisions for people and for myself.
When you just said that, like, I think I shared with you a few weeks ago or maybe a month ago that I was starting a lot of my sessions with like donkey calf raises, tibia, and reverse hypers, all non-fatiguing. And it was just like priming my body for whatever I was doing, and I felt great. And again, I don't know how or why I came to those conclusions of, hey, this is a great idea. I'm going to write it down and try it. But it kind of goes back to the conversation you and I had beforehand. Like, I just love fucking around and finding out. And I was like, you know what? This is going to be fun. Let's just try it and go for it. And
Right.
then next thing you know, it's like, oh man, what you just said of like, it really made everything with my erectors having a mild pump. Everything in my back was able to work better. I was able to stabilize better and it just felt more secure. So,
Hips probably felt a lot better too.
yeah. Oh God, yeah. Yep.
Yeah,
And like
that's your
the reverse
structure.
Correct. And like, I know a lot of times people will say, like, oh, well, why do you choose a reverse hyper? And like, for me, I'm getting not only erector, glute, hamstring turn on, but I'm getting spinal decompression simultaneously.
Mhm.
Which to me is always, since I'm seated a lot, is incredible. Like, that's how I logically thought about it because I can tell you when I do it, I get off of it. I'm like, oh God, I just feel right. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
And so like, the flip side of that, just because me, like, being in a hinge and getting well, I don't hinge well, I'm all back, getting my erectors flared up, prohibiting hip mobility, does that mean I should never work erectors? No. There are ways that you can eccentrically orient them. And if you can eccentrically orient them, you're actually going to recapture some motion, probably build some durability in the patterns either have or don't have. So there's a lot of clinical reasoning, and this is why anyone that comes on with me, I have them go through like a 15 test video test battery. Um,
Those are not easy, by the way.
did I give you all of them?
It was a ton of YouTube videos and I had to copy them.
Oh, that's right.
I still
Sorry.
have the videos on my phone.
I filmed new ones.
Ah, very cool. Oh, good. Good. Heck yeah. Good. Good for you.
Um, because based on earlier, where I was going, put your chest up, put your chest down, turn, and like looking at how that changes rotation, you can kind of start to appreciate how those tests, if I know what shape you're at, what motion you should have, and then what your tests actually look like, we start to get a little bit more kind of clinical reasoning in terms of why we may want to use different corrective exercises or why certain training movements might be more of what I would call like a high support movement, meaning something that actually works to recapture the motion you should have versus high exchange, which kind of redlines either direction that might not be best for your structure, but it's fun to do. Like that's deadlifts for me. It's not great for me, but I love doing it. Um, so yeah, that's cool. There's things can make so much more sense. And in the office hours that I run, I brought up a point a couple weeks ago that like, what if you could predict what hinges, what volume of hinges and squatting patterns are going to be best for your clients?
Oh, that'd be incredible.
You can't, but we need a biomechanical model that matches some of the biopsychosocial stuff in autonomics to permit that. So one of the coaches was like, "Whoa, how do you do that?" And I was like, "Man, that is rib cage and pelvis structure shape. It's super cool." So yeah,
All right, cool. We skim the surface of rib cage. We will do more in depth because like I really liked what you said about the rib cage shape and dynamic being a billion opportunities, right? Because I don't think that's something that most consider, right? Because here's how when you said that, here's what I heard. That's like saying that everyone that has an XX chromosome looks this way, and everyone with an XY chromosome looks this way. And you and I both know it's a crazy gamut.
that's a great way of saying it. Well, I think that's important too because people always want things to make sense to them,
Right.
right? They want to identify as something because that lends clarity. When there's clarity, it gives us action. There's like everything feels better, right? So there are a couple of very big influencers out right now that have been out for years, but they'll tell everyone they have this like left AIC pattern. And long story short, what that does basically is have people go, oh, okay, like that's me, that's the thing.
Right. Yeah.
But it also builds on some catastrophizing and some over-identification with a problem rather than solution. And so the more we dialogue about these things, just like you and I talk about with training, it's like there is no one right answer. You just need to look at where you are right now.
Yes.
And logically, what do those tests tell you? So
It's
yeah.
very similar to you remember. I feel like when I started personal training people, everyone wanted to put people in like those somatic groups where it was like ectomorph, mesomorph,
Oh
endomorph.
my God, yeah.
And what's funny is right, like initially, if you look at me as like a teenager, like, oh, okay, literally, the dude's supposed to be skinny, right? And then now if you ask somebody like, oh, he's supposed to be muscular, this is his destiny. I'm like, no,
This is him. What's
right?
funny is like there's writing that goes back in osteopathy back to like the 1860s. It talks about these types. And that's like the same archetype stuff that I'm talking about with like the wides and the narrows and like what you were, as personal trainers, like the mesomorph, ectomorph, like this has been going on for literally centuries.
Yes.
And it's like I was saying at the beginning, there's literally nothing new under the sun, very little new under the sun.
Right.
So hearing something new doesn't necessarily mean it's a new shiny thing. It probably means there's a new lens that you've not seen,
Right.
but that lens needs to be layered on top of others.
Yes. Cool. All right. We have a lot more to talk about.
Okay.
So
Drop
until
us comments, please.
say what?
Drop us comments, please, on
Yes.
this. Let
Yeah,
me know where you
please.
take this.
Yes. Detailed, thorough questions are appreciated,
Okay.
not vague gray ones. Like how tell me about ribcage. Like that's a terrible question. Like that's an example.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot. Kind of base my career on it.
How many hours do we have, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, cool. Until next time, Cris, Dani, we are done.